Surprise! And welcome to my next board game video. This time we're going to cover Twixt. And let's just get right into it, but give me a couple seconds. I got to go find my pants. Okay, so today I'm going to do a review for the board game Twixt. And I was inspired to do so when I did my last board game review for the game Pushover. Both of these games are designed by a guy named Alexander Randolph. And he was somewhat of a prolific board game designer. Also wrote a few books. He was born in Czechoslovakia on May 4th, 1922. May the 4th be with you. Both of his parents were artists. Father was a painter, mother was a sculptor. And he did a couple of other things before he settled into designing board games. He was in military intelligence for a bit, and he was an advertising copy editor in Boston. But in 61 he moves to Japan, he gets into designing board games, and in 62 he, along with a gentleman named Sid Sackson, were commissioned to start a new board game division for the 3M company. We talked about that a little bit in the last video. A huge company known primarily probably in the modern era for their tape, 3M tape. But man, they have been into a lot of things over the years. And oddly enough, in the 60s and into the 70s, they had a board game division. And so what they wanted him to do is to, him and Sid, I should say, it was to design some board games in a series of games called the Bookshelf series. And the idea was to make these board games that would fit in a box that would store sideways on a bookshelf. And so Twixt was one of those games, very successful for them. And so he went on and designed a bunch of other board games, won a bunch of awards, and including in 2011, he was inducted into the Origin Awards Hall of Fame as a designer. By the way, the Origin Awards is a organization that specifically gives out awards for the game industry. Now, this has nothing to do with the movie that Francis Ford Coppola made back in the, I think that was also 2011, and it was called Twixt. And it was a horror suspense movie, but had nothing to do with this. And notable about this game also is just the fact that it's a very simple game. It reminds me of something like checkers or marbles or something like that, where it's just really straightforward. However, it is a particular type of game, and I do love doing a whole bunch of research on this stuff. And if you go to the Board Game Geek website, they talk about this extensively, and they call it a connection type game. And there's all kinds of different types of games, battle type games, and there's the roll and move type games where you roll dice to determine how many positions you move around the board of play. But this here is, like they say, a connection type game where you go from one side of the board to the other, and the first person to do so wins. And so let's get into it. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically read through the instructions. It's a very simple game, so this ought to go pretty quick and pretty easy. And so this is a game for two players, black and red, as you can see. Red always goes first. I do want to also note that according to Board Game Geek, again, it looks like they did some good research on this. After the game was initially developed, they added a rule which was called the pie rule. And the idea is that in a lot of board games, the first person to move gets a little bit of an advantage. So the idea was, when red makes the first move, black person could then say, okay, I want to become red now. And so they could possibly take an advantage away from the red if they wanted to, but they didn't have to. And then now the first guy, he goes again because now he's black and he makes his move. And so again, what we're talking about is going from one side of the board to the other, and it's just a matter of linking across in turn. And of course, you're going to be doing one of two things. You're either going to be trying to build that connection, or perhaps trying to block your opponent from making that connection. So those are the two basic types of moves you're going to make. Or I suppose if you're really good, maybe you do both at the same time. Red is one player, black is the other. Border row is another term, and that's this outer row. The red border row and the black border row, and again, red and black border row. Privilege. Really? This stuff has also gotten into board games? Okay. Now that's something that only takes place in double Twixt, but I'm going to save that one for you later. I'll describe that later when we're talking about the rules. It's easier to understand what that means after you've learned about the game first. So we'll go over that later. Barrier is just simply as you're going around, if someone puts a block in front of you, they call that a barrier instead of a block. Twixt, again, is that basic linking move where when you get two pegs set up to where you can link them together, that's called a Twixt. Not Twixt with the T, but just a Twixt. Double linking is when you start with one peg. Who knows what the black guy does? Maybe he's off on another part of the board, so you put a peg here. Now, no matter what the black guy does, you're going to be able to go either here or here and do a double link. No way he can stop you from doing that. He can't put one in both holes. He can only go either one, even if he puts a peg here. Here, you know, it doesn't matter where he puts his peg. Once you get that configuration, you can put that in the middle. And there's a few other moves like that, which I'll go over in a minute. Those are called setups. So a setup is a planned pattern of pegging which permits the player, wow, that's a lot of alliteration, permits the player to double link in either of two directions. And so there's 4 different types of basic setups. I just showed you what they call a beam setup. There's another one called a mesh, which is the same thing that just goes east to west instead of north to south. Then there's this other one that's called a tilt, which is more like, you know, if you start there and then you go here, you actually can Twixt in those two directions, right? So it's the same thing that I just showed you, but instead of being strictly north, south, east, and west, it's just sort of tilted, which is why they call it a tilt. And then the last one's called a Cong, C-O-I-G-N. I'll have to look that one up and edit later. But that's when you, you know, if you just look at these patterns, if there's a red peg there, and one there, and one there, and one there, you've got this same sort of pattern where, you know, if you start out, let's say you start with that position and then you go there. Nothing the black guy could do to stop you from putting a peg either here and double linking or a peg there and double linking, because you've just set that up. That's why they call it a setup. So these are just tactics that you can use to build, you know, links, or I think of it as building a bridge from one border wall to, or one border row to the other. So this is a 2-player game or a 4-player game where you have partners, where there's one guy on each side of the table, partners in red, partners in black on either side of the table. And when you play that way, you know, take turns, rotate around the board. But at any point in the game, each player has got the ability to yell out privilege. And what that means is, it's red's turn, say it's this guy's turn, red, and he puts down a red peg. If he immediately calls privilege, what that means is this black guy that normally goes next, skip him, and your partner gets to make a move. And then you just kind of continue on from there. So you just skip the next player. Again, each player can do that one time during a game. And communication between partners is strictly forbidden. So you cannot talk about strategy or tactics or anything. And so that's pretty much it. This is a very straightforward game. As you can see, you're just linking from one side to the other, or maybe trying to block your opponent from linking from one side to the other.